But I have to tell you that to think that there is such interest after nearly 50 years since this event is quite extraordinary. But I think that since it's Earth Day that we're celebrating, it's appropriate. Okay, so say 45 years now ago, I was a new legislator in the New Hampshire legislature, and I had no idea that across the world there was a man who was doing everything that he could to turn the seacoast of New Hampshire into Houston or Dallas or New Jersey, the worst parts of those states, Texas and New Jersey. And here he is. And here he is on his wedding day, about 4 years before. And this is 4 days after he married, and 4 days after he married Jackie Kennedy in October of 1968. He was in close discussion with Greek Prime Minister Colonel George Papadopoulos. Onassis and Papadopoulos were planning a massive project called the Omega Project, and it was intended to involve shipyards, power plants, aluminum facilities, and oil refinery. Onassis was particularly interested in the refinery because he had a large fleet of hundreds of VLCCs. VLCCs are very large crude carriers, ships that carry crude oil. But they were all empty. He had no crude. He had nothing to do with them. And it was, although it was the major element of the Omega Project, it actually was the only one that survived for Onassis. Everything else was taken over by Stavros Niarchos, his main rival. But the oil refinery remained an important part of Onassis's plans. There was a small startup newspaper in Durham. Actually, it was in Newmarket, but it was called Public Occurrences, and it was begun by Phyllis Bennett and her husband Steve, who together with their friend Dick Levine, they had all worked on the Baltimore Sun, but they had all this common dream of having a small country newspaper. And so they came to New Hampshire and they started Public Occurrences. They called it Public Occurrences after the first newspaper in this country, which was Public Occurrences, and only ran one issue. So this Public Occurrences began with issue number 2. Seemed appropriate. They had been in New Hampshire and the paper had been going for a few months, but only a few months, when this story appeared, Dark Shadow on Durham Point. The dark indicates tells the bizarre story of a mysterious land grab on Durham Point when a dark shadow was cast over the town because nobody knew what people were trying to buy the land to do. And in the next 6 months, Public Occurrences proved to be absolutely essential in the effort to beat Aristotle Onassis and the refinery plan. When no other paper would cover the proposal, Foster's didn't, the Portsmouth Herald didn't, the Globe didn't, Portland Press Herald didn't, Public Occurrences published critical information and was eventually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Public Occurrences' early alert resulted in this cartoon of beseeching bandits imploring the citizens of the seacoast to option their land for reasons variously stated. Sometimes they represented that the land they wanted was for a game preserve, sometimes for a resort, sometimes for a massive golf complex, and sometimes because the realtor, Peter Boris, wanted to raise his son in a more rural atmosphere than Keene, New Hampshire, where he was living. These bandits were asking for us to trust them and to allow the construction of the world's largest oil refinery, a 400,000 barrel per day refinery, almost twice as big as the largest refinery of that time, the Exxon refinery in Texas. There would be a massive terminal for offloading supertankers at the Isles of Shoals. And here we have Onassis. To his left is Peter Boris, the real estate agent who maneuvered to get options and was previously known for the invention of something called the endless loaf of bread. Clever man. Behind him is William Loeb, editor of New Hampshire's only statewide newspaper, and to his left is Meldrum Thompson, our governor. Excuse me. Maybe this will help. When public occurrences broke the story of what was intended for our little town and the New Hampshire seacoast, it was indeed a dark shadow. Lost in the mists of time is any information on how the members of this group found one another and whose idea it was to build a superport at the Isles of Shoals and a refinery on our lovely Great Bay. Now, it could have happened at a cocktail party in New York where Thompson met Onassis or his representative. Thompson is not an unlikely initiator of this scheme. After all, it was he who hatched the plan to get Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket to secede from Massachusetts and join New Hampshire, and the carrot that he offered them was the promise of a nuclear power plant. But I digress. The carrots that Onassis was offering New Hampshire were cheaper and more plentiful fuel, jobs, and lower taxes. Let's focus a little bit on the state of the world and the economy in 1974. There was a huge shortage of gasoline and heating oil. Cars lined up for blocks to get gas at the few stations that still had some to sell. The SOS UNH Committee of Faculty members, which I haven't mentioned before, I'm sorry. SOS had been begun by Nancy Sandberg, and she pulled together the most extraordinary group of people. They eventually ended up with 4,000 members. One of the things that SOS did, Nancy was the chair of it, one of the things that SOS did was to create a UNH committee of faculty members, one of whom is with us today, Fred Hocraft. Raise your hand, Fred. There he is. And this committee set about researching these three carrots that Durham and the seacoast were being offered, and managed to debunk every one of them. The one that Fred particularly took an interest in was the potential for pollution from spills that was going to very likely occur. But one other thing that the committees focused on was the fact that we had been promised cheaper and more plentiful fuel, and yet there were these lines. So the committee said, well, let's see how things are going in New Jersey and in Texas outside of refineries. Let's see how they are doing there. Well, they found out that the lines outside of refineries were just as long in the towns, and that the price of fuel was a cent more per gallon. So that took care of that one. Then there was the question of jobs, and it turned out that really the only jobs that would be available would be for people who had experience in the oil industry, and there were very few of those in New Hampshire. And the third one was taxes. Surely all of us in New Hampshire are, at least our reputation is that we are tax averse. So there's the economy, and there is the model of the refinery. This is a tiny bit of what it would have been, but if you look at it, you can't even see the only part that would be taxed, because the only part of that refinery, of all of that mess, would be the administration building. That's the only one that was considered to be real estate. The tanks are apparently can be disassembled, taken down, so they weren't included as real estate, so they wouldn't have been eligible. There would be zero tax relief. Here are some examples of what we were fighting. There's a refinery in Texas. Here's one in Union Pacific. I'm not sure where that is. And here's another lovely thing. And I'm sure some of you know Katie Wheeler from Durham. And Katie Wheeler wrote a letter to Olympic complaining about the oil refinery and saying it's not right for our town. And she received a letter back that basically said, "Little lady, you don't understand. An oil refinery is as clean as a clinic. And at night when it's lit up, it looks just like a Christmas tree. But we in New Hampshire know otherwise." So here's what we in Durham would be giving up. The beautiful bay, wonderful growth there. And at the Shoals, I was a freshman state legislator in 1973. I hadn't spoken on the floor of the House. I had sponsored very little legislation. I was a real rookie. But I had some seasoned friends, of whom one was Marty Gross, a lawyer from Concord, who, sitting at my kitchen table just after I was elected, said to me, "If you ever want to get something through the New Hampshire legislature, use these two words, home rule." I tucked that piece of advice away. And the legislature met in biennial session at that time, and to introduce a bill in an off year, it was required that it be shown to be responding to an emergency. So I looked up the word, and this is what I found. Emergency, an unforeseen combination of circumstances that calls for immediate action, an urgent need for assistance or relief. I successfully argued that point to the Speaker, that the proposal to impose an oil refinery on my town constituted an emergency. And then I recalled Marty Gross's wise words. I would use home rule as the foundation of my bill. Now, home rule is not a very noble concept. It is pretty conservative, but it was the highest rung on the ladder that I could grab. And home rule existed then and still exists in many ways in New Hampshire. If your town allows the sale of beer or has the sale of beer, it is allowed by that town. That's home rule. If cigarettes are sold in your town has at one point voted to allow that. If there is a racetrack or gambling or lottery tickets sold, all of those come under the home rule law. But I wanted to extend that to include an oil refinery. I mean, who would have ever thought that we would be needing to do that? So I introduced what became known as House Bill 18, a very simple bill that said this bill would require a vote of approval of a majority of the town voters to the approval of a site plan for an oil refinery. And we were off to the races. If Onassis had his way, the lovely Isles of Shoals, beautiful and lovely Great Bay, would be forever transformed into a Down East nightmare, reminiscent of the worst of New Jersey and Texas. And public occurrences, once again, came to the fore and printed this wonderful article. 1,000 acres at that time. Before they were done, there were many more than 1,000 acres that had been auctioned off by people who did not know the purpose of the refinery, the purpose of the land grab. There were people who resisted. There were heroes. Norman Beaudet was a janitor at the Memorial Union building at UNH, and he had an ancient family farm, many acres, in Durham. His house is just a good, solid New England farmhouse. He was offered $1 million for his property, and he said, no. Where would I live with $1 million? And here is a map that shows, that's the most that I can show you. I don't have anything that shows more than that, but there was more than the red that was eventually auctioned off. And that, if you can see, the red is what was auctioned off. The green is the downtown Durham, and the blue is UNH. This line here is not what was auctioned off. That is where the pipeline was going to go, so that out here would be Lunging Island and a mono buoy with storing fuel in it, and piers that I'll show you later. And then it was to come to Concord Point in Rye, and then up under the bay, overland, and then under the bay to Durham, where it would be refined. And before it was over, more than 1/2 of all of the land in Durham was optioned. This is, of course, Celia's garden. So this, it's impossible to even consider what was going to happen to this. And it was not until early December that the minutes of the Star Island Corporation first indicated knowledge of the refinery proposal and its implication for Star Island and the Shoals. And reading now from the minutes of the annual meeting held in December of 1973, quote, "The president then announced that the meeting would turn to a consideration and discussion of the most serious threat which has been made to the Isles of Shoals, vis-a-vis the desire of Olympic Refining Company to create an oil terminal in the vicinity of the islands." End quote. The president further reported that the board of directors had retained the services of William Orcutt, Esquire, a partner in the Manchester law firm of Wigan and Norrie, and that Governor Thompson of New Hampshire is, quote, "trying in every possible way to secure for New Hampshire an oil refinery and an offshore terminal located between the Shoals and the mainland. This offshore terminal so located poses a serious threat to our operation and to that of the Shoals Marine Lab on Appledore." He pointed out that, quote, "one Loeb, who was publisher of a Manchester, New Hampshire newspaper, and who was working closely with Governor Thompson and Olympic in this matter, published a lead editorial under the attractive caption, quote, 'Let the Yankee bastards freeze.'" Attorney Orcutt said that he was guardedly hopeful that Olympic might be discouraged from attempts to obtain a refinery site in New Hampshire, but that would not necessarily rule out the possibility of an offshore terminal near the Isles of Shoals. Now, if they had what they wanted at the Isles of Shoals, this sort of thing, this kind of pier, is what they had in mind. Star Island itself would be used for a radar installation and as a staging area for swapping crews. And to service the many huge ships that would bring crude oil to Star Island, 2 piers were planned. One, the length of 3.5 football fields that would accommodate 90 supertankers a year, and another, the length of 3 football fields that would accommodate 179 smaller tankers annually. A gigantic mono buoy to store crude oil or refined oil was proposed. As I was looking through pictures and doing research on this, I came upon the next picture, which I think really says it all. Imagine that at the Isles of Shoals, extending, say, from Smutty Nose or Star or Appledore, Duck, who knows? And another one. This is probably what Star would look like. And this is the slide I'm talking about. That was the motivation. Anyway, as the plans were made more fully public, response grew, and the Star Island Corporation stated, "We believe we have the resources, human and financial, to maintain our position on Star Island and will utilize those resources to the fullest extent possible." Rosamond Thaxter, owner of Smutty Nose Island and coincidentally my daughter's godmother, said, quote, "Only over my dead body will anyone unload tankers there." And anyone who knew her knows that that's what she said. Many shoalers were in touch with the Star Island officials, offering whatever help they could. Lobsterman Norm Foy, whose family owned Cedar Island, and Ed Warrington and Rodney Sullivan, both landowners on Appledore, were recorded as being against any oil terminal anywhere near the shoals. John Kingsbury, director of the Shoals Lab, stated that even a small oil spill in that area would be enough to put the lab out of business. This is Lunging Island, and it's the only house on Lunging Island. And to me, it's a bit of heaven. So there it is. And Onassis tried to option several islands, but failed until he turned his attention to rugged and beautiful Lunging Island. Peter Boris, real estate agent from Keene, pursued the Randalls with a deceptive vengeance. He told Mrs. Randall that he wanted the 5-acre island for resort development. And in Durham, we heard that the Randalls had been contacted, but we were sure that they would hold out. After all, their son, who had been killed in Vietnam, was buried there, and the island had been in their family for generations. Mrs. Randall said, "This is one of the most beautiful spots we have on the Atlantic coast. This area should remain inviolate. It's an important part of the nation's beginnings that most people have never heard about." And in fact, Lunging Island was the fishing base of the London Company as early as 1615. The Randalls said they weren't interested in selling, and they didn't hear any more about it for several weeks until a real estate agent representing Peter Boris showed up. And by this time, they had read press accounts of the refinery, and they were putting two and two together. And they asked the realtor directly if the sale was related to the rumored oil refinery, and he eventually admitted that it was. Mr. Randall felt it was time to meet with lawyers, all of whom told him that if the refinery went through, the state would likely take their land by eminent domain as being for a public purpose to provide oil in an emergency, and they would probably be paid a lot less than if they took the Olympic's offer. So when they were told that 2 other islands had been optioned, which was not true, and the owners of a 3rd were listening, the Randalls finally succumbed. And they optioned the island. Mrs. Randall said, "It's like a death in the family of somebody very close." Now look carefully at this house on Lunging Island, because the next 2 slides also show it and will give you an idea of the scale of the Olympic proposal. The circle in red is the island, is the house. The rest is the island. And there is the island with one of Onassis's ships behind it. So you get an idea of how really grim it was. But the Olympic people wanted this so desperately, and they decided that they should hold a public meeting where everyone could come and ask their questions and be informed. And so in February, they invited all skeptics to a meeting at the UNH Fieldhouse, and they promised to answer all questions. But it didn't go well for them. For one thing, Fred Hocraft was there, and when they claimed that there had been no oil spills in a refinery off Santa Barbara, I believe it was, Fred stood up, walked to the stage, and flung his dossier of papers down on the stage. They paid attention to that. Another event at that meeting was Cliff Horrigan, whom some of you may know because she lives now in Portsmouth, was there. And Olympic had claimed that they needed 6,000 gallons of fresh water a minute. And Cliff was a graduate hydrology student. And she got up and she said, could you tell us, please, where you're going to get 6,000 gallons of fresh water a minute? To these 8 men across the, seated in their captain's chairs across the stage. Mr. Green is on the left, and he was sort of the leader of the band. And so Cliff asked him, and he stood up, and he went back, and he conferred with the others behind him. It took a minute or two, but by the time he came back to the microphone, he felt comfortable saying they just realized that they only needed 3,000 gallons of fresh water. But Cliff Horrigan didn't stop there. She said, and where are you going to get 3,000 gallons of fresh water? He went back and asked them again, and he returned to the microphone, and he said, we really only need 1,500. So the place went wild, and there wasn't a believer left. None left. Nancy Sandberg and SOS worked very hard on getting signatures for a petition stating that the signers were opposed to the oil refinery. They obtained more than 4,000 signatures. I offered to take the petition to Concord and present it to the governor. I called the governor's office to make an appointment and was given a time. And when the day approached, it was canceled. So I made another, and it too was canceled. The governor's secretary said he was out of state trying to line up fuel for snowmobiles. But eventually I got an appointment that was not canceled, and I made my way to Concord. And when I got there, I went to the governor's council chambers to wait to see Governor Thompson. I waited and waited and waited. The press was there too, hoping to get a picture of the petitions being presented to the governor. We waited some more. We waited together. Finally, a photographer asked if he could take a picture of me with the petitions. So I said yes, and he snapped this picture. Deranged woman, right? And at just that moment, the governor's secretary came in and asked me to come in to see the governor. So right away, Thompson asked me why I had brought him the petitions. I said I'd brought them because I thought he'd like to know how his constituents felt, thousands of them. He asked how I knew they were his constituents, and I said because there's a column for them to record where they live. Then he asked how I knew that they were voters, and I told him there was a column for that too. Nancy Sandberg and SOS had been right on top of it. We had a short discussion about the fact that the gas shortage was not of refined oil, but was, after all, of crude oil. He became angry, and he told me to get off my high horse and get out of here, which is just what I did. I curbed the impulse to slam his very heavy, large oak door, but I didn't. Anyway, town meeting day came. We had a wonderful moderator, Joe Michael, a lawyer, and he was strict and even-handed, and the meeting got underway. Nancy Sandberg spoke and got a standing ovation. The only thing to be discussed that night was the oil refinery. All other items that were to come before the town meeting were put off for a totally different meeting. Tommy Thompson made the unpopular case for the refinery. There were many who spoke, but finally it was time for the town to vote. and it voted 1,200 times no. It was, and by a margin of 9-1, Public Occurrences recorded this vote. Now, the vote in Durham had absolutely no legal binding effect. It was a referendum that indicated the town's feelings, but no less and no more. The weekend before this vote, Olympic had spent $1 million to put a flyer in every single Sunday paper in the state, urging citizens to talk to their legislators, getting them to support the refinery. But eventually, the day after the town meeting, the legislature was scheduled to vote on my bill, House Bill 18, the bill that required the approval of a community before an oil refinery could be sited within its bounds. The House was packed, and so was the balcony, as you can see. People and media had come from all over the world to witness the vote. But preceding the vote on House Bill 18 was a vote on House Bill 34, which would establish an energy siting body that would have the authority to override any zoning or wishes of a community in the siting of energy facilities. It was voted down, setting the stage for House Bill 18, the Home Rule Bill. I made an impassioned speech asking for the votes of all those from Coos to the sea. And the non-binding but huge no vote in Durham the night before was there to help persuade legislators from Berlin and Salem and Nashua and Concord and Manchester to join the legislators from the seacoast, and the bill became law. And it was over. And in reporting on that day, the New Hampshire Times had this to say: a century from now, when historians look back on the 1974 session of the New Hampshire legislature, they'll call it the Oil Refinery Session and remember March 7th as a turning point in New Hampshire history. That's the day when, unexpectedly, the 400-member House, the House too big to be bought, said no to the plan of a foreign billionaire to build a $600 million oil refining complex on Durham Point in violation of a local zoning ordinance. So the House never specifically voted against the oil refinery, and the town of Durham never addressed the question of a zoning ordinance variance because Olympic never asked for the variance. Olympic knew they would fail when on March 6th, Durham voted 9-1 to oppose the refinery, and on March 7th, the New Hampshire House voted to sustain the town's right to have the final say. So, nearly 40 years later, a bench constructed from 60-million-year-old New Hampshire granite was made with proceeds left over from a production of a wonderful play written by Portsmouth's own Ed Valina called Oily Vey. And the bench is inscribed, Durham says no to Olympic Oil, March 1974. And here am I, Phyllis, and Nancy on the bench, which has been placed on Wagon Hill Farm in Durham by the lovely bay. And so, Star Island and the Shoals survive, as do Durham Point and Great Bay. And the sun continues to rise and set over our beautiful ocean. And all seemed well, but a final story. A group of us went out to dinner at a restaurant in Concord the night after the legislature voted, and all was going well until I looked across the room and there was a table at which all of the consultants for Onassis and Olympic were. And I moaned when they got up and headed in our direction. What were they doing? Were they announcing plans for a refinery in Rochester or Sanford or Newmarket? Any of which would have had huge implications for the seacoast, but that was not what they were doing. Mr. Green, their leader, came to our table, shook my hand, and said that they had come to tell us that they knew that the right side had won. And so I hope you'll join me just simply to say thank you to Public Occurrences and Phyllis Bennett for breaking the story and altering and alerting the seacoast and eventually the world to Onassis's proposal. To Nancy Sandberg, who had the skills and intellect and energy and commitment as a young mother to create SOS and to organize the people of Durham in opposition to the refinery. To the good people of Rye, who formed concerned citizens of Rye to protect the seacoast. To two Rye sisters who were steadfast in their opposition to allowing pipelines across their land. To the fishermen of the seacoast who could see the damages that would be incurred in constructing the pipelines. To Marty Gross, who counseled me on the subject of home rule. To Representative Chris Spiro, who shepherded House Bill 18 through the New Hampshire legislature. To Sharon Meeker and her crack committee of UNH researchers. To Cliff Horrigan for asking about 6,000 gallons of cooling water. To Norman Bodette, who turned down $1 million, saying, "But where would I live?" To the Portsmouth Athenaeum for some wonderful pictures of the shoals. To retired Star Island CEO Tony Cotting, who helped me in my research. To Rosamond Thaxter for her feisty opposition. To John Kingsbury for his attention and vigilance, and to the Star Island Corporation for its unwavering operation, and to Lisa Santilli and Joe Watts for inviting me to celebrate this here with you this evening. Thank you.